The radio altimeter chirped twice and went silent when Major Myra Kovac noticed the needle on her attitude indicator drift half a degree it had no business drifting. 22 years of flying, 16 combat deployments, and in all that time she had learned that the instruments never lied first, the pilot's attention lied first, and the instruments simply waited to be believed. She logged the anomaly the way she logged everything, without comment, without alarm, filing it into the part of her mind that kept score on machines the way other people kept score on weather. 3 minutes later, the radio carried Romeo 6 Actual's voice, thin and clipped, reporting contact, reporting numbers superior, requesting anything that could fly. Then the transmission cut mid-word, not faded, cut, as if someone had reached out and closed a hand around it. She was flying an A-10 that had been scheduled for retirement 4 times and saved 4 times, because there was no piece of paper anywhere that could explain what this aircraft did to the men and women on the ground who heard its engines and knew, in their bones, that the day was about to change. It had been built in a decade when nobody believed a jet needed to be ugly to be loved, designed around a cannon instead of the other way around, built to survive damage that would kill anything sleeker. The Air Force had tried to send it to the boneyard more times than anyone could count anymore, and every time someone found a reason it had to stay a little longer. It wasn't fast, it wasn't elegant, it wasn't anything you'd put on a recruiting poster next to the newer jets. It was simply there when it was needed, stubborn and slow and impossible to kill, and the thought came to her unbidden, the way it always did on mornings like this one. It flew like she did. The briefing the night before had been short, almost dismissive, the kind of briefing that told her exactly how little weight this mission carried in anyone's mind but her own. The room had smelled of burnt coffee, and the particular staleness of recycled air that every operations building seemed to share no matter what country it sat in, and the fluorescent lights overhead had buzzed at a frequency just low enough to notice, and just high enough to be impossible to ignore once noticed. The colonel had stood with his arms crossed the entire time, the posture of a man checking a box rather than sending people into the sky. Simple reconnaissance run, he'd said, the words themselves doing most of the work of convincing the room that nothing serious would happen out there. He had a habit, she'd noticed over the years, of looking just past her when he spoke, at a point on the wall slightly to the left of her head, as though eye contact might commit him to something he preferred to leave unspoken. Her wingman was young enough that the uniform still looked borrowed on him, his flight suit creased in places that hadn't yet learned the shape of his body, and during taxi he'd asked her, half joking, half not, whether she ever got nervous anymore. She had told him no, which was true in the way that mattered and false in every other way. The weather that morning had been the kind of clear that made pilots suspicious. No wind, no cloud, visibility for miles, the sky behaving exactly the way skis behave right before they stop behaving. She had watched the sunrise come up over the eastern ridgeline in a wash of pale gold that turned the frost on the tarmac into something briefly, almost embarrassingly beautiful, and some old superstition in her, the kind every pilot carries and none of them admit to, had noted that mornings this pretty were rarely mornings that stayed simple. The valley below them had looked, an hour earlier, like nothing at all. Just rock and scrub in the long cold shadows that mountains threw before the sun found its angle, ridgelines stacked one behind another in graduating shades of gray-blue until the furthest ones dissolved into haze. Snow clung in the high shadowed folds where the sun never quite reached this late in the season, and from altitude it looked like lace laid carelessly over stone. The engines had been steady, oil pressure nominal, temperatures where they belonged, the whole aircraft humming along in that particular register of controlled violence that she had long ago stopped hearing as noise and started hearing as conversation. She had let herself half listen to her wingman's chatter about a girlfriend back home, while some small, permanent part of her brain kept doing what it always did, scanning for the one thing that didn't belong. She found it in the radar returns before she found it anywhere else, a flicker, gone before she could be sure she'd seen it, the kind of ghost signal that could mean equipment fatigue or could mean something had started jamming her, and she had no way yet to know which. The radio died in stages, which was somehow worse than dying all at once. First, the static, thick and wrong, swallowing half of every transmission, the kind of interference that came with a texture to it, almost physical, like trying to hear someone speak through a mouthful of gravel. Then long silences where there should have been chatter, the ordinary background hum of other stations, other units, other business being conducted across a dozen frequencies, all of it gone quiet in a way that felt less like absence and more like held breath. Then nothing at all, not even the empty hiss of an open channel, just a dead, complete quiet that told her every frequency she owned had gone dark simultaneously, which was not something equipment failure did on its own. Equipment failed one circuit at a time, one relay at a time. This had failed all at once, everywhere, and that told her more about what she was dealing with than any diagnostic panel could have. Her wingman's aircraft, which had been off her right wing a heartbeat earlier, was no longer on her scope. She rolled her head to check visually and found empty sky where a jet should have been, the particular vertigo of a landmark disappearing without explanation. She was alone at altitude with a full weapons load and not one authority left in the world who could tell her what to do with it. No communications meant no approval. No approval meant no authorization. No authorization meant that whatever happened next would be entirely hers to own in the room with the windowless walls where people would ask her to explain herself. She ran the equation anyway because that was the only thing left to run. Heavier was not the right word for what the weapon's load felt like now. More committed was closer to it. She had enough ordnance to reshape the terrain beneath her, and without coordinates, without confirmation of friendly positions, without a single voice to tell her where the line was, that firepower was worse than useless. It was a liability with wings, a threat to everyone in the valley, including whoever she was supposed to be protecting. No comms meant no approval. No approval meant no authorization. No authorization meant everything from here forward was on her and only her. She saw smoke rising from 3 separate points in the valley and did the only thing that made any sense, which was descend, against every safety protocol she had ever been taught, low enough to see with her own eyes what her instruments could no longer tell her. The descent itself was its own small violence, the aircraft shuddering through thicker air, the ground rushing up in a way that always felt faster than the numbers said it should, the cockpit filling with the smell of hot metal and ozone that came with pushing an airframe harder than its manual strictly recommended. She held the dive a beat longer than instinct wanted, because instinct was built for safety, and this moment required information instead. What she saw did not improve on the way down. Romeo 6 Actual was pinned in a fold of rock that gave them almost no cover, a squad reduced to hugging what little stone the terrain offered, muzzle flashes visible even from altitude in short disciplined bursts that told her these were people trying to make ammunition last rather than people with plenty to spare. The force arrayed against them was not the loose, scattered kind of threat a route reconnaissance was supposed to encounter. It was organized, moving in coordinated rushes from cover to cover. Numbers she counted twice because the first count seemed too large to be believed. She counted out of habit, out of the same compulsion that made her check gauges she already trusted, and the math came back bad. Very bad. Single squad, no armor support visible, terrain offering the defenders nothing but a few meters of rock and the fatting hope that help might still be coming from somewhere. She made the decision in the space between 2 heartbeats, the way she had made every decision in her life that had mattered, not because she had time to deliberate, but because deliberation was a luxury for situations where inaction was survivable. This was not one of those situations. She didn't care what regulations said about authorization at this exact moment. The objective was safe, and that was the only metric that mattered to her now. Her first pass was a warning, not a killing blow, deliberate offset, loud enough to announce intention without committing to consequence yet. Let them know something was watching. Let them scatter and second-guess the ground they thought was theirs. The cannon beneath her, 7 barrels turning together at a rate that made the individual rounds indistinguishable from one another, threw rounds downrange fast enough that the sound reached her ears as one continuous roar rather than individual shots. A sound she had felt in her chest more than heard in her ears every single time she'd fired it in 22 years, and had never once gotten used to. Depleted uranium met rock and dirt in a line that made its point without asking permission from anyone, throwing up a curtain of debris and dust that hung in the cold air longer than it should have. The enemy formation broke apart, men scattering from positions they had held with discipline a moment earlier, and Romeo 6 bought 4 minutes they hadn't had 30 seconds earlier. She pulled up out of the dive and felt something in Engine 1 announce itself with a shudder that hadn't been there on the way down, a vibration that traveled up through the airframe and into the base of her spine, where 22 years of flying had taught her to feel problems before her eyes found them on the gauges. The oil pressure gauge on that engine had begun its descent into the red, unhurried, patient, the way real emergencies almost always were despite what the movies wanted you to believe. Nothing in a real cockpit announced itself with a scream. It announced itself quietly, a needle drifting the wrong direction, a number that used to sit comfortably in the middle of its range now creeping toward the edge of it, and the quiet was somehow more unsettling than an alarm would have been. She had flown through worse than this, an engine fire over open water once, 400 miles from the nearest usable runway, and a hydraulic failure years before that had taken her 100 miles on backup systems and stubbornness alone, landing on a strip half the length regulation called safe. She ran the new math without panic, minutes before something failed outright, maybe less depending on how generous the engine chose to be with what remained of its oil. The smart choice, the choice a rational person makes when a governing body is not watching, was to turn for home while the aircraft could still make the decision on her behalf. She considered it, weighed it honestly, turned it over the way she turned over every decision that mattered, looking for the flaw in it the way she looked for flaws in everything. She was tired of safe choices. She had been tired of them for longer than she could easily admit, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with a lifetime of doing the correct thing at the correct moment and wondering, quietly, in rooms nobody else occupied, whether correct and right were actually the same word. The memory that rose then was not one she summoned so much as one that had simply been waiting its turn, patient the way old memories are patient, content to wait years for the exact moment they were needed. She was 12 again, in a country that had stopped being safe sometime before she had words for what safe meant, standing in a yard that smelled of wood smoke and cold stone, while her father knelt beside the wreck of a small propeller aircraft that had come down 2 fields away weeks earlier, its metal skin already rusting at the edges where the weather had gotten in. She remembered the particular sound the wind made moving through the broken fuselage, a low, tuneless note that changed pitch as the gusts shifted, and the smell of scorched paint that clung to the wreck even months after whatever fire had taken it had gone out. He had run his hand along a bent strut the way other fathers touched things they loved, unhurried, almost reverent, and he had told her that flying was never really about the machine. The machine was only ever the shape that Courage happened to be wearing that day. Courage needed a shape to travel in, he'd said, the way water needed a container, and sometimes the shape was a propeller and a few sheets of aluminum, and sometimes it was a person, and either way you could always tell it by what it did when things went wrong rather than by how it looked when things went right. He had died 11 weeks later in an attack that never made international news, one name among many the world had no room to remember, folded into a casualty count that some newsroom somewhere had reported as a single unremarkable line and then moved on from. She had stood at his grave in a coat too thin for the weather, her mother's hand gripping hers hard enough to hurt, and she had made a promise with the flat, absolute certainty only a child can manage, a certainty that had never once wavered in 3 decades even as everything around it changed. She would fly, she would matter. The present came back to her the way the ground always came back after a steep bank, all at once and entirely real, the vibration of the failing engine, the cold sunlight through the canopy, the valley still smoking beneath her, and she understood, flying wounded over ground half a world from that yard, that this was what mattering had always meant. Right here, right now, not the promise she'd made at 12, but the thing the promise had been pointing toward the entire time. The enemy regrouped on a new position, further up the slope where the rock offered better cover, moving with the kind of discipline that told her this wasn't the first fight they'd ever been in. She came in low for the second pass, low enough that the terrain itself became a kind of threat, low enough that the aircraft's own shadow crossed the target before the rounds did, low enough that for one suspended second she could see individual faces turn upward before the world beneath her rearranged itself entirely. The valley changed permanently in the seconds that followed, the cannon's report rolling off the surrounding ridgelines in overlapping echoes that made it sound, for a moment, as though the mountains themselves were joining in. She pulled up through smoke that was hers, that she had made, banking hard enough that the G-forces pressed her into the seat and turned her vision briefly gray at the edges, and felt the second engine begin to complain in a register she recognized from training manuals she had hoped never to need outside a classroom. The left engine quit without drama, just a change in the pitch of the world, a silence where there had been sound, the kind of silence that a pilot's body registers as danger before the mind has finished processing what happened. The aircraft immediately began pulling in a direction it had no right to pull, yawing hard toward the dead engine, and she corrected with rudder and muscle memory built over 2 decades, the kind of correction that lived in the hands before it ever reached conscious thought, her foot finding the pedal and pressing before the thought "I need rudder" had even fully formed. Every pilot who had ever flown this aircraft had trained for exactly this failure, drilled it in simulators until it stopped being frightening and became merely difficult, a checklist of compensations rather than a crisis, and she was grateful now, in a distant clinical way, for every tedious hour of that training, every session she had once resented for its repetitiveness. The fuel gauge told her she had perhaps 30 minutes left, maybe less depending on how honestly the single remaining engine chose to behave under the strain of carrying a load it hadn't been asked to carry alone. The base was further away than that math wanted to allow. She decided she would solve that particular problem when it became unavoidable and not 1 second before. Single-engine flight wasn't optimal, but it was survivable. The only real question was whether she could stay airborne long enough for survivable to matter. It was the maintenance controller on the one frequency that briefly, miraculously reopened who heard something in her voice crack for the only time that entire day, not a break exactly, just a fraction of strain in a sentence that should have carried none, a half-second hesitation before the word status that any other day would have gone unnoticed. He did not respond with more technical instruction. There was a pause on his end, the particular pause of a man deciding whether to say something outside his job description, and then he told her instead that his daughter's name was Anya, that she was 7, and that he would tell his own daughter exactly what he was about to tell a stranger 100 miles away: hold the wing level, and you've got this. It steadied her more than any checklist could have, that small human thing offered into all that static, a stranger's daughter's name arriving over a dying radio like a hand placed briefly on a shoulder, and she answered him in the flat professional voice she had carried since sentence 1, the crack already closed, already filed away with everything else she wasn't going to feel until later. Below her, Romeo 6 Actual was not a faceless designation, but 7 people she would never meet properly, though she would carry pieces of that morning with her for the rest of her life regardless. There was a medic among them working over one of the wounded with a calm economy of motion visible even from altitude, hands moving without wasted gesture, the particular competence of someone who had done this exact thing too many times to be anything but efficient about it now. There was a squad leader directing the retreat toward the extraction point in shorthand signals, conserving voice and breath both, and a younger soldier, barely more than a boy, she thought, in the same way people had once thought that about her, laying down covering fire from behind a boulder with the kind of focused, almost mechanical concentration that either meant training had taken over completely or fear had burned away everything except the immediate task in front of him. They used the 4 minutes she had bought them exactly as she'd hoped they would, not wasting a second of it, moving the wounded first, the ammunition second, themselves last, the way soldiers who trusted each other always seemed to organize a retreat without anyone needing to say so aloud. The radio crackled once more before it died again for good, long enough to pass her position and Romeo 6's location to someone who could act on it, long enough to hear that help was 11 minutes out. She did the fuel math without flinching. 11 minutes was more than she had probably, unless the aircraft chose generosity over physics, which aircraft rarely did. She stayed anyway. She watched the friendly unit begin moving toward the extraction point below, carrying their wounded between them across ground that offered no real cover, each meter covered at a pace that looked agonizingly slow from altitude and was, she knew, almost certainly as fast as exhausted bodies carrying wounded weight could manage. She flew a tight, deliberately visible orbit above them at an altitude that made her the obvious target, daring anything left down there to come up and meet her instead of them, her own aircraft, a lure circling patiently over ground that had already tried to kill everyone beneath it once that morning. The last threat came from a ridge she hadn't cleared, anti-aircraft fire rising in a lazy arc that would have looked almost beautiful if it weren't aimed at her, tracer rounds tracing pale lines against the pale sky, in a geometry that some detached part of her brain noted was almost elegant even as the rest of her calculated intercept angles and evasive options. She didn't evade it. She turned into it, because a threat that reveals itself is a threat you can finally answer, and answered it with the last of what the cannon had to give Winchester, the old word for empty that had outlived every war that had coined it, the readout confirming what her hands already knew from the sudden absence of recoil feedback through the airframe. The fire beneath her stopped. Whatever had been on that ridge either died there, or decided very quickly that the risk had stopped being worth it. The helicopters arrived a heartbeat later, dropping into the valley in a formation that looked from above like rescue finally remembering its cue, rotor wash kicking up dust in wide circles as they flared for landing on ground barely wide enough to hold them. She watched the friendly unit load, counted heads the way she had counted enemy numbers earlier, methodical, unable to stop herself from doing the arithmetic even though she already dreaded what it might tell her, and came up one short. One of them had not made it, a fact she absorbed the way she absorbed everything that day, completely, and without a single visible sign on her face. The grief filed alongside the fear and the crack in her voice and everything else that would have to wait its turn until she was alone. There was nothing left to do in that valley. She turned the wounded aircraft toward home on an engine that had no business still turning, on fumes measured in minutes rather than gallons, and watched the horizon for a base that took longer to appear than any horizon ever had. The mountains slid by beneath her canopy in the same graduating blue-gray they'd shown her at dawn, except now every ridge and fold of rock looked subtly different, marked by the morning in a way that had nothing to do with the terrain itself and everything to do with what she now knew had happened on it. The single engine ran rough in a rhythm she catalogued constantly without meaning to, listening for the change in pitch that would tell her it was finally done, bargaining silently with a machine that could not hear her and would not have cared if it could. The tower gave her emergency clearance before she finished asking for it. A controller's voice clipped and fast in the particular way that meant they'd already guessed most of what had happened out there from the shape of her call alone. The aircraft made sounds on final approach that no engineer would have signed off on. Groans and rattles traveling up through the airframe that told her every bolt and spar was held together by something that had stopped being purely mechanical several minutes earlier, momentum maybe, or stubbornness, or the same simple refusal to quit that had kept this exact aircraft out of 4 separate boneyards. She flew the approach the way she had flown 10,000 approaches before it, on muscle memory, because there was nothing left in her to spare for anything else, her hands making the small constant corrections a landing required without her conscious mind directing a single one of them. The main gear hit harder than any instructor would have allowed a student to log, a jolt that traveled up through the seat and into her spine, and she held the aircraft dead straight down the centerline through sheer force of will translated into rudder pedal, the nose wheel settling a half-second later, the brakes doing their unglamorous essential work as the runway markers blurred past slower and slower. The aircraft slowed, stopped. And then, as if it had been waiting for permission the entire time, the one working engine finally gave out on the taxiway with a sound like something exhaling for the last time, a long descending whine that ended in silence more complete than any silence she'd heard all day. She guided the dead weight clear of the runway on momentum alone, using the last of it precisely, and ran the shutdown checklist anyway, every switch, every step, in the exact order she had run it 10,000 times before, even though both engines had already made the decision for her hours, minutes, seconds earlier. Habit was powerful, training was more powerful still. She sat there afterward for 1 full minute, alone in a cockpit gone entirely quiet, hands still resting on switches that no longer had anything left to control, letting herself feel finally, privately, everything she had spent the last hour refusing to feel. Her hands, she noticed distantly, had gone cold. Her chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the harness. The base around her had gone very still in the particular way a base goes still when word travels faster than official channels ever manage, ground crew and off-duty pilots drifting toward the flight line without quite admitting to themselves why they'd come outside. The afternoon light had shifted while she was gone thinner and more golden the way it does late in the day, and the air smelled of jet fuel and hot asphalt and the faint metallic tang that clung to an aircraft that had spent the morning doing things aircraft weren't meant to do. Somewhere behind her a maintenance crew was already approaching the wreck of her jet, with the particular hush of people about to see something they'd talk about for years. The colonel who found her on the tarmac had the same unreadable face he always wore, arms uncrossed for once, and he looked first at the aircraft, scorched and holed and barely a shape anymore, streaked black along one wing where something had very nearly finished what the enemy fire had started, and then at her. "What the hell did you do out there?" he asked, and there was something underneath the question that wasn't quite anger, though it wore anger's clothes for a moment before settling into something else. She told him the truth in 3 words. "My job, sir." Something moved behind his expression that wasn't apology. He never apologized, not once, not to anyone, not in all the years she'd known him, but it was recognition, plain and grudging and real. The look of a man revising an opinion he'd held comfortably for a long time and did not enjoy revising. "That was some of the best flying I've seen in 20 years, he said, and walked away before either of them had to decide what to do with the moment, leaving her standing alone in front of the wreck with the crowd still gathering at a respectful distance. Pilots and maintainers and support staff had gathered without quite meaning to, watching the aircraft the way people watch something that has clearly cheated an ending it was owed. Murmurs passing back and forth as more of the story reached them in fragments. Someone had heard it from the tower, someone else from the maintenance controller who'd spoken to her over that one brief open channel, the details growing slightly with every retelling the way details always do. Somewhere in the crowd someone began clapping, a single pair of hands, and others joined until the sound filled the space between the hangars and she did not turn around. The mission was over. There was always another one waiting behind it, and turning around to acknowledge applause had never once in 22 years struck her as part of the job. The debrief took most of the next day in a windowless room built for exactly this kind of conversation, fluorescent light and a long table, and a recorder placed carefully in the center of it, its small red light blinking with a patience that felt almost cruel. They asked her about unauthorized weapons release, about protocols she had broken in sequence, about the value of the aircraft she had nearly destroyed keeping it airborne as long as she had, and she answered every question precisely without embellishment, offering only what was true and nothing that softened it, nothing that dramatized it, nothing that asked for sympathy she hadn't come there looking for. The threat of a court-martial sat unspoken in the room the entire time, present in the careful neutrality of every question, in the way the officers across the table avoided committing to any expression until they had heard everything. The senior officer across the table, a brigadier general with silver at her temples and the kind of stillness that came from decades of watching people try to talk their way around hard truths, let the silence sit before she finally spoke. "Major, your actions were," she said, and paused long enough that the room felt the weight of it, the recorder's light blinking twice in that pause, irregular. "You broke communications protocol. You engaged without authorization. You risked a valuable aircraft for personnel who might have been extracted another way." The silence that followed was its own kind of verdict, and Meyer had learned long ago not to fill silences that weren't hers to fill. And then, after a pause that had clearly been chosen for exactly this effect, the general's voice shifted register entirely. "You also displayed precisely the tactical judgment and initiative this service claims it wants from its best people. You're being put forward for a commendation." Would you be interested in building a new squadron from the ground up? She didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am, absolutely. The story moved through the base the way stories like it always do, growing a little each time it changed hands, gathering embellishments that made a difficult, ugly, exhausting morning sound cleaner and more heroic than it had actually felt from inside the cockpit. She never once corrected any version of it. Let them have their legends, she thought. Reality had been complicated enough without her competing with the myth of it, and there was something almost merciful in letting people believe the cleaner story if it helped them sleep. If it gave the newer pilots something to measure themselves against that didn't include the parts that had kept her awake for a week afterward. Her old wingman came to find her weeks later late, when the hangar had emptied out and there was no one left to perform for. The overhead lights dimmed to the half-power setting used after hours, and the building holding that particular echo empty hangars always seemed to hold. He sat down without asking, on the same crate she was using as a bench, close enough to make clear he'd come to talk rather than merely to sit nearby. You went toward the fight, he said, not quite a question, his voice smaller than it had been during that taxi weeks earlier when he'd asked her if she ever got nervous. She nodded and told him the one thing her call sign had always meant to her, that showing up mattered more than being seen to show up, that the difference between a phantom and a hero was that a phantom did the work and let the story take care of itself, and took him on as her wingman properly, this time with both of them understanding what the job actually cost, no illusions left between them about what the sky demanded in exchange for what it gave. The aircraft itself never flew again. The crew chief who inspected it afterward went pale doing it, running his hand along a spar the same way her father once had along a wrecked propeller strut, telling her flatly that by every reasonable measure it should have come apart in the air long before it reached the runway, that he'd seen combat damage before but never damage this extensive still attached to something that had managed to land itself in one piece. It was retired to a museum eventually, moved on a flatbed through streets lined with people who had no idea what they were watching pass, her call sign painted along the nose beside a small constellation of stars marking the lives it had helped save that day and others like it. Children walked past it bored, not understanding what they were looking at, tugging at parents' hands toward brighter, louder exhibits elsewhere in the hall. Veterans paused longer reading the placard, remembering, some of them running a hand along the fuselage the way you'd touch an old friend's shoulder, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. She visited once, years later, on a quiet weekday afternoon when the hall was nearly empty, and stood in front of it for a long time, seeing not an exhibit but something closer to an old partner who had simply gone quiet, who had given everything it had to give and asked nothing back except to be remembered honestly. She commanded her new squadron the way she had flown, present, exacting, never satisfied with a desk when a cockpit was available instead, walking the flight line most mornings before the sun was fully up because she had never once believed leadership meant watching from the ground. She flew regularly long after regulation would have let her stop, logging hours other officers her rank had stopped bothering to log, because a squadron commander who never flew was, in her estimation, only half a commander. The call sign that had started as a nickname became something closer to a standard other pilots measured themselves against without quite saying so out loud, the kind of quiet reputation that outlasted rank and outlasted postings, that followed her from base to base the way weather follows a season. She retired eventually at the rank of colonel, in a ceremony crowded with generals and officials whose names she would forget within a week of hearing them, polished shoes and prepared remarks and a band playing something appropriately solemn. But what she noticed, what actually mattered to her, were the handful of faces from that valley who had flown in specifically to be there, the medic older now graying at the temples, who had worked over the wounded that morning with such quiet competence. The squad leader who had directed their retreat in careful hand signals, standing in the back row in civilian clothes that didn't quite fit the occasion, having clearly come a long way to stand in a room for 20 minutes and then leave again. That mattered more to her than every ribbon pinned to the ceremonial uniform she wore that day. She died decades later at 78. Quietly in her sleep, in a small house not far from the base where she'd spent the final years of her career, and the funeral that followed was full in a way that surprised even the people who had loved her, because it turned out that an enormous number of strangers had spent their whole lives carrying a story about her without ever having met her, pilots who trained under officers she'd trained. Ground crew 2 generations removed from anyone who'd actually served with her, all of them present because a story had reached them somehow and had lodged itself somewhere it mattered. Afterward, the people who had actually known her told stories about one thing in particular, more than any medal or headline or citation, the way she always, without exception, showed up. Not the Valley story, though that one got told too, retold in the same embellished versions it had always worn. What they told instead were the smaller things, the The way she'd walk the flight line before dawn checking on ground crew nobody else bothered to check on. The way she remembered names and kept remembering them years later. The way she never once, in 4 decades of service, let a subordinate fly a mission she wasn't willing to fly herself. But what they remembered most in the end was something simpler than heroism. When you needed her, she arrived like a phantom out of the clouds, exactly when hope was thinning, exactly when it mattered most. And that, more than any medal or commendation or ceremony ever could, was what made her irreplaceable.